Minister to respond.
Good morning, Mr Owen. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to start by thanking my honourable friend for Weston-super-Mare for raising the debate today, because the issues which it raises go to the very heart of this government's economic approach, which is to get our finances in order and to build for the long-term success of the country. And I read with great interest my honourable friend's paper with the Social Market Foundation, and indeed might consider purchasing it as a small Christmas gift. The objectives that inform this paper are all ones which I share, and I'm sure members on both sides of the House will share too, namely to see the UK's economy strengthen and to grow sustainably in the future. So let me start then by addressing the suggestion of sovereign wealth funds more generally, because I agree that they can form an important part of any country's strategy for investing in their future success. Often, they are a way for governments to manage fiscal surpluses, foreign currency operations, or balance of payments surpluses. They can indeed be an effective tool for both planning sustainable investment and managing volatility in receipts. And we've seen how they can work well in action for countries which have large fiscal surpluses. Honourable members have mentioned Norway's government pension fund. There is Saudi Arabia's SAMA foreign holdings fund, but we're not debating today the valuable role sovereign wealth funds play in other countries around the world. We are looking at the UK, and we're looking at whether such a fund would be appropriate for the UK and, importantly, appropriate at this time. And as the House is fully aware, we're not in the same position as many other countries which have elected to set up such funds. The crucial point is that the UK has not run a surplus since the start of this century, but we are now committed to doing so. We have chosen a path of credible fiscal policy that will restore our economy for long-term health. And though we are no longer seeking to deliver that surplus in 1920, we remain resolved to do so in order to bring about public finances to balance. That's why we committed once again in the autumn statement to do so. We set out a plan to see this happening as soon as possible in the next Parliament, whilst in the interim bringing cyclically adjusted borrowing below 2% by the end of this Parliament and getting public sector net debt as a share of GDP falling in this Parliament too. So I share my honourable friend's conviction in the need for strong and sustainable public finances for the UK. And I understand his interest in exploring the potential for a British sovereign wealth fund. And I agree with the honourable member from Strangford that the country should be prepared for a rainy day. It's a very sensible advice that we should all listen to. But given the UK debt will soon be at a 50-year high of 90.2% of GDP, our first priority must be to return the public finances to balance and to get the debt falling before we could consider a sovereign wealth fund in more detail. While it may not be an appropriate avenue for us to explore at this stage, I do want to touch on some of the issues its consideration here has raised. One example of that has been our infrastructure, because one of the key roles that a sovereign wealth fund can perform is a vehicle to fund sustained investment in infrastructure. And while we may not have a sovereign wealth fund or even a formal statutory target for the proposition or proportion of our GDP which we invest in infrastructure, the government does share my honourable friend's conviction to make the investments we need in the infrastructure that will really boost the productivity and strengthen our economy. And that's why we've asked the National Infrastructure Commission to make recommendations on the future infrastructure needs of the country. And I'd like to refer all honourable members once again to the commitments we showed recently in the autumn statement, where we prioritised high-value investment in our infrastructure and innovation. And that included the new National Productivity Investment Fund with £23 billion of extra spending targeted high-value projects that will deliver more opportunities, high living standards for working people. And whether that's more homes, better transport links or 21st century digital capacity, we need. I will.
I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman giving way. I mean, he's setting out the circumstances is why he agrees it's not relevant to set up a wealth fund, sovereign wealth fund today. But will he accept and agree that there was a missed opportunity with the 340 billion bounty that came from North Sea Oil to use those benefits in the past to establish an oil fund that would have given benefits for today and for the future?
I often say as an MP, and I suppose the same is true as a minister, it would be nice to have a crystal ball, a magic wand, and in answer to this question, perhaps a time machine. We are where we are, and we have to make the decisions that are best going forward rather than looking back in anger, if I may quote the Honourable Labour member. The additional capital will take public sector net investment to over 4% of GDP for the rest of this Parliament, which is well above the average of the last 30 years, and in real terms over 50% higher on average this decade than under the whole period of the previous government. Another aspect of my honourable friend's excellent paper was the suggestion that a new national debt charge be carved out of income tax to help pay down the debt. He will know how much I share his conviction that we need to get debt falling. However, I know he also shares the government's commitment to helping people who are just about managing. It is important that we build an economy that works for everyone. And that's why we would not look to deliver a new income tax charge in our current position. Indeed, as part of the tax law, we have legislated not to increase the main rates of income tax, national insurance contributions and VAT during this Parliament. And alongside that, we have prioritised an approach to taxation that supports working people, such as our increase in the tax-free personal allowance.
Just to make sure that we're all clear, I would just like to clarify that my paper supports what he's just describing. The proposal in the paper for the national debt charge would not begin until the budget was in balance and would only equal what we were already going to be paying anyway in debt interest to begin with. So I can reassure him that I'm not suggesting an undercutting or a swerving away from the fiscal rules announced in the autumn statement. Those are essential to get us to the point where the budget is in balance, as I think he's ably laying out at the moment.
I thank my honourable friend for demonstrating again what a sensible person he is. The member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber asked about North Sea Oil, why we didn't create a fund back then. I have to tell him, which he knows full well, that successive previous governments made use of the revenue from North Sea Oil to support public finances in the years which the revenues rose. But I also can tell him that going forward from April 2017, his Scottish Government will have the powers to contribute to their own reserve fund if they so wish. So it is something that perhaps he might consider. We all agree that investment in infrastructure is key to growing the economy, and that's why, as I mentioned, the extra £23.7 billion announced in the autumn statement is important. It takes the total we are spending to £170 billion during this Parliament, and it will improve productivity, increase standards of living, and is an essential part of our plan going forward.
I do think he is being very generous. Around half of the extra 23 billion that the autumn statement has put into infrastructure investment is actually going into housing. How does that raise productivity?
Well, I have to tell him that housing does raise productivity. It's a much needed part for our economy. People need affordable homes to rent or to buy, and the building process, as I'm sure he's aware, creates jobs, increases prosperity and increases productivity. The Honourable Member for Strangford mentioned shale gas. This is a suggestion that's been made by others. I have to tell him that the UK does not currently meet the criteria of a country that would benefit from a shale wealth fund. We have a high debt and a large deficit, and we do not have extensive commodity or natural resource exports. The development of the shale industry would leave a positive legacy for local communities and regions where it's based, and this government's policy is for those communities to be able to choose to invest the funds for the long term. I'd like to thank him as ever for making a very thoughtful contribution, which I think added greatly to the debate as well. The Honourable Member for Harrow West, who apologised for not being present during my speech, which I appreciate, asked about lifting investment restrictions on the Crown Estate. I think it's an interesting idea, and I will do as he asks, which is to write back to him on this matter. The Honourable Member for East Lothian, I'd like to thank him as ever for his thoughtful contribution. He mentioned intergenerational fairness. I agree with him that intergenerational fairness is a very important issue, but at 90% of GDP next year, our debt is just too high. This represents a burden on future generations, and it's important that we retain our focus on and our priority to return the public finances to balance and to get the debt falling. And this means that we are not currently able, and it would not currently be appropriate for the UK to set up a sovereign wealth fund. He also mentioned taxation levels, and I feel duty-bound to remind him that tomorrow, for the first time, his party, the SNP in Scotland, will be able to put up taxes, put their money where their mouths are, if they choose to do so. So I will give way.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way a second time. He's been very generous. I just want to pick him up on the point which he's now mentioned twice about prioritising, I think rightly, reducing the overall level of debt in the economy, well, government debt in the economy, once we have eliminated the deficit. I would completely applaud that, but would he also accept in return that the debt that is denominated as gilts, as bonds, is only part of the overall picture of liabilities which the government and successive governments have loaded up, and that a very large proportion of the total liabilities, a large proportion than the actual debt denominated as bonds, is embedded in the state pensions and benefits system, and it would be a mistake for any of us to ignore the liabilities there. They are equivalent to debt, and that therefore at some point we need to face up to the costs that includes, as well as the ones which he's rightly pointing out on the bonds themselves.
Yes, I thank him for that point, and I do accept that the debt is made up in a variety of different ways. Mr Owen, can I commend my honourable friend once again for securing the debate, which has been very interesting, and we've heard some significant issues discussed that affect the British economy. There are many areas where my honourable friend and I are in full agreement, but I'd like, in closing, to highlight three key aspects of that. First, that rebalancing the economy is necessary and important. Second, that dealing with the deficit and getting debt falling is necessary but not sufficient to rebalance the economy, and a dynamic and strong economy where the growth is shared across all parts of the UK is what we need. And third, on the effectiveness of sovereign wealth funds in various countries, although I must repeat our conviction that it would not be appropriate for the UK at this point in time, when our priority needs to be getting the debt falling, I Indeed, I note, as my right honourable friend writes in his paper, there is little point in attempting to build up such a fund when debt is at its current historic high levels. My honourable friend's desire to live within our means, the honourable member for Strangford used the expression to cut our cloth accordingly, to secure our public finances, to get debt falling, to invest sensibly in our future success, are all important areas. They represent core priorities for this government, and priorities were reflected in the approach we outlined in last month's autumn statement to build an economy that works for everyone. Thank you.
Everybody for very long, but what a splendid debate, because there is, I think, a high degree of consensus across parties, with a few isolated islands of holding out against the principle. But quite a lot of this debate, Mr. Owen, has been about how we might do this and different competing mechanisms for how we might build up the fund and when we should have started. But a widespread agreement that, in principle, such a fund is desirable. The SNP say we're in favour of the principle of a sovereign wealth fund. They were arguing that we should have started earlier and built it up from oil, but nonetheless they were in favour. The voice of Northern Ireland, and particularly the Honourable Gentleman from Strangford, agrees and says he was brought up to save for a rainy day, as were we all, Mr. Owen, and is absolutely right. Honourable Gentleman from Harrow also brought up the Co-op Party's suggestion, very similar, not identical to mine at all, but nonetheless very, very helpful. I'm not sure that the Labour Party, while the Honourable Gentleman was very, very kind in his remarks about my paper, that we are necessarily on the same point about generational justice. I think they put less weight on it than I do, although I would like to reassure him that the fluctuations he's worried about in the fund needn't be fatal at all, but that's for a longer conversation on another occasion. And the Minister was very, very helpful in accepting of the three questions which I asked, that is rebalancing needed? Yes, it is, and he was very, very clear about the desirability of making our economy more robust and more sustainable as a result. Is debt repayment insufficient on its own? Do we have to take into account these broader liabilities that we owe in order to rebalance the economy? Yes, it is, and he was very, very clear about that. And he left the door temptingly open, Mr. Owen, about whether or not this proposal is the right answer. He is, I think, fulsome in his acknowledgement of the strengths and benefits of sovereign wealth funds around the world. He rightly says, and my proposal acknowledges, that it would be wrong to start such a thing now. And he leaves the door temptingly ajar that it might be something we should consider in future, but of course he cannot, and I understand that, commit HMG to that at this point. But I think that gives us plenty of opportunity on a cross-party basis to come back and make sure that chink of light is brought into full, bright flowering later on.
I'm grateful to the member. The question is, the House has considered the UK Sovereign Wealth Fund. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order. We now